Well, if it isn't Madison Reed. Still going by your maiden name, I see. Couldn't quite let go of the old identity. Huh. The mocking voice carried across the ballroom, drawing all eyes to the woman in navy blue who stood perfectly still, her face a careful mask of composure. Have you ever stood face to face with someone who once broke you, while they tried to humiliate you all over again? That moment when your ex-husband is broadcasting your failures to an audience, making you feel small again. Madison Reed never expected her high school reunion would become the stage for her ex-husband's attempt to publicly shame her, or that it would end with him learning the most devastating lesson of his life. What happens when the man who discarded you discovers you've become the wife of his powerful boss? Stay with me to witness one of the most satisfying moments of poetic justice you'll ever see. Hello, my beautiful queens. Today's story is for every woman who's been made to feel small by someone who promised to cherish you. For those who rebuilt after a man convinced you that you weren't enough. There's power in standing in your truth when others try to rewrite it. And yes, my loves, in that perfect moment when the universe responds to someone who underestimated your worth. This isn't about revenge. It's about reclaiming your power and finding love that stands beside you, not in front of you. Sometimes, the best answer to someone who tried to dim your light is simply to shine brighter than they ever thought possible. Madison Reed stepped into the dimly lit ballroom of the Embassy Suites in downtown Chicago, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. It was her 25-year high school reunion, and she hadn't wanted to come. But old friends had insisted. Maddie, you've come so far. Let them see how beautifully you've rebuilt. So here she was at 48, wearing a simple but elegant navy dress that flattered without trying too hard. Her silver-streaked hair swept into a loose chignon. She carried herself with the calm confidence of someone who had survived worse nights than this. The room buzzed with laughter, clinking glasses, and the inevitable, "You haven't aged a day." Compliments that everyone knew were lies but appreciated anyway. Madison smiled politely, hugged a few classmates, and sipped her sparkling water. She had no illusions about the evening. Brian Cooper would be here, her ex-husband of 22 years, and he had never been one to let an opportunity for self-aggrandizement pass. Madison Reed. Oh my God. Look at you. Turning, Madison found herself enveloped in a cloud of expensive perfume as Valerie Winters, former head cheerleader and eternal social butterfly, pulled her into a tight embrace. Val, it's been forever, Madison said, returning the hug with genuine warmth. Valerie had been one of the few who'd reached out after the divorce, offering support without judgment. Too long, Valerie agreed, stepping back to appraise her. You look amazing. That divorce diet clearly worked wonders. Madison laughed softly. More like they've finally taken care of myself regimen. Well, it's working. Valerie's expression softened. I'm glad you came. I wasn't sure you would with, they both knew. Brian Cooper, high school football star turned Madison's college sweetheart, husband, and eventually, the man who'd left her for his 28-year-old assistant after 2 decades of marriage. I almost didn't, Madison admitted. But then I thought, why should I be the one to stay away? This is my history too. Valerie squeezed her arm. That's my girl. And just so you know, Team Madison is strong in this room. We all remember who helped organize every class fundraiser, while someone was busy networking at golf tournaments. The subtle dig at Brian made Madison smile. Thanks, Val. I appreciate the alliance. As Valerie drifted away to greet other classmates, Madison took a moment to scan the room. The years had been both kind and cruel to her former classmates. Receding hairlines and expanded waistlines mingled with designer outfits and carefully maintained appearances. Everyone trying to present their best version, to prove that life had treated them well. And then she saw him. Brian stood near the bar, louder than she remembered. His belly a little rounder under the tailored suit. His laugh a little forced. He had remarried quickly after their divorce. A younger woman named Tara who posted endless vacation photos on social media. Brian had climbed the corporate ladder at Grand Industries, a mid-sized manufacturing firm that had grown steadily over the last decade. He liked to brag about it. Madison felt a familiar tightness in her chest. the echo of pain that had once been debilitating but had dulled over time. She took a deep breath, reminding herself of Dr. Levine's words from therapy. Your worth isn't determined by his actions. His choices reflect on him, not you. For a moment, Madison was transported back to their kitchen in Lake Forest, 5 years ago. The granite countertop cold beneath her palms as she steadied herself, staring at the text messages on Brian's carelessly left open iPad. Messages to Tara, his assistant. Messages that left no doubt about their relationship. Messages that made it clear this wasn't new. It doesn't mean anything, Brian had said when confronted, his tone more annoyed than apologetic. It's just a fling. These things happen in long marriages. But it wasn't just a fling. It was the culmination of years of subtle dismissals, of Madison's needs being secondary, of her career sacrificed for his, of her identity slowly eroded until she was just Brian Cooper's wife, rather than Madison Reed, the woman with a finance degree and dreams of her own. A burst of laughter pulled Madison back to the present. Brian was holding court, surrounded by a small cluster of former football teammates, all hanging on his every word like an audience waiting for a show. His gaze swept the room and locked with hers. Recognition. Then something predatory flashed across his face. He was coming over. Of course he was. Madison straightened her spine, took another sip of her sparkling water, and prepared herself. She'd known this confrontation was inevitable. She just hadn't expected it to happen so soon. Well, Brian said, voice carrying just enough to draw eyes as he approached with his entourage. If it isn't Madison Reed. Still going by your maiden name, I see. Couldn't quite let go of the old identity. Huh. Madison met his gaze evenly. It's my name, Brian. Always has been. He chuckled, glancing around for approval from his audience. You know, folks, Maddie here used to tell me I was holding her back. Said I wasn't ambitious enough. Funny how things turn out. I'm regional VP now at Grant Industries, big salary, company car, the works. And you? He gestured vaguely at her. Still doing, what was it? Bookkeeping for that little accounting firm? Must be tough watching from the sidelines. A few people shifted uncomfortably. One woman Madison remembered from Cheer Squad murmured, Brian, come on. But he wasn't done. No, it's fine. I get it. After the divorce, she needed someone to blame. But look at her. Alone, no ring, probably still paying off those credit cards we racked up together. Some of us move up. Some of us stay stuck. Madison felt the old sting, but it was duller now, more like an echo. She had spent years in therapy, rebuilding her self-worth brick by brick. She had learned that silence wasn't weakness. Sometimes it was the strongest response. She opened her mouth to reply, calmly, nothing dramatic, when the double doors at the far end of the ballroom swung open. A tall man in a charcoal suit entered, scanning the room with quiet authority. Michael Grant, CEO of Grant Industries, Brian's boss. Michael was 52, silver at the temples, broad-shouldered but unpretentious. He carried himself like someone who had earned every inch of his success through hard work, not bluster. He spotted Madison immediately, and his face softened into a private smile that made her heart lift. He crossed the room without hurry, ignoring the sudden hush that fell over the crowd. Brian froze mid-sentence, his smirk fading as recognition hit. Michael reached Madison's side, slipped an arm around her waist, and pressed a gentle kiss to her temple. Sorry I'm late, sweetheart, he said, voice warm and steady. Board meeting ran over. The room went deathly quiet. Brian's face drained of color. Mr. Grant? What are you doing here? Michael turned to him, expression mild but eyes sharp. I'm here with my wife, Brian. Madison Grant. He emphasized the last name just enough. If you've ever had someone try to diminish your worth in public, hit that like button right now. Brian blinked rapidly, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Your wife? Michael nodded. We married 18 months ago. Quiet ceremony, family and close friends only. I didn't realize you'd be entertaining the room with stories about her tonight. A ripple of whispers spread through the crowd. Tara, standing a few feet away, looked like she might faint, her perfectly manicured hand clutching at her cocktail dress. I didn't know," Brian stammered, his earlier confidence evaporating. "I mean, congratulations, sir. We were just catching up. Old times." Michael's tone stayed even, almost kind. "Old times can stay old, Brian, especially when they involve dragging someone's name through the mud in public. Madison has more grace in her little finger than most people manage in a lifetime. She doesn't need to defend herself. But I will say this once. Disrespect my wife again, in any setting, and we'll have a very different conversation on Monday. In my office." Brian swallowed hard. "Yes, sir. I'm sorry." As Brian retreated, visibly shaken, Madison felt a strange sense of déjà vu. Not from the reunion, but from 25 years earlier, when she'd first met Brian Cooper at Northwestern University. She'd been a sophomore, serious about her finance major, focused on graduating with honors. He'd been a senior business major, charming and confident, captain of the lacrosse team. "You're the only girl in the library on a Friday night," he'd said, sliding into the chair across from her. "That either makes you incredibly dedicated or incredibly boring." She should have recognized the subtle negging for what it was. But at 20, Madison had been flattered by the attention from the handsome senior everyone knew. "Dedicated," she'd replied, not looking up from her textbook. "Some of us actually have to work for our grades." He'd laughed, genuinely delighted by her retort. "Ouch. Fair enough. I'm Brian Cooper. I know who you are. And you're Madison Reed, finance major, 3.8 GPA. Turned down for the Morgan Stanley internship last summer, which was their loss." That had made her look up. "How do you know that?" I asked around. His smile had been disarming. "I notice smart women, especially beautiful ones who don't seem to realize they're beautiful." It had been the beginning. Coffee dates that turned into dinner dates. Study sessions that became less about studying and more about talking until the library closed. Brian had been attentive, interested in her thoughts, impressed by her ambition. He told her she was brilliant, that she'd be running Wall Street someday. "We'll be a power couple," he'd said. "You in finance, me in business. Unstoppable." They'd married a year after Madison graduated, despite her parents' concerns about the rush. "You have your whole career ahead of you," her mother had cautioned. "Make sure he supports your dreams as much as his own." At first he had, or seemed to. Madison had landed a job at a respected financial firm in Chicago, while Brian started at Grant Industries in their management training program. They'd rented a small apartment in Lincoln Park, both working long hours, meeting for late dinners where they'd excitedly share their days. But slowly, subtly, things had shifted. Brian's career had taken precedence. His networking events, his business trips, his need for a wife who could host dinner parties for his colleagues. "It's just for a few years," he'd assured her when suggesting she scale back to part-time after his first big promotion. "Until I'm established. Then you can go full throttle with your career." A few years had turned into a decade. Part-time had become occasional consulting. Madison had found herself managing their home, their social calendar, their entire life, while Brian climbed higher at Grant Industries. When she tried to restart her career in earnest after turning 40, Brian had been dismissive. "Why now?" he'd asked over dinner at Gibson's, not even looking up from his steak. "We don't need the money. And honestly, Maddie, the finance world has changed. You'd be starting from scratch." "Because I need something that's mine," she tried to explain. "Something that uses my brain, my education." He'd finally looked at her then, with a mixture of pity and impatience. "You have plenty. The house, your charity work, your book club. Most women would be grateful. Most women." As if she were being unreasonable for wanting more than a beautiful cage. A month later, she discovered the texts to Tara. 6 months after that, Brian had moved out. A year later, their divorce was final, with Brian keeping the Lake Forest house and Madison receiving a settlement that seemed generous on paper but barely covered a modest condo in Evanston and basic living expenses, while she tried to rebuild a career from ashes. "You okay?" Michael's voice, low and concerned, pulled Madison back to the present. His hand was warm against the small of her back, grounding her. "I'm fine," she assured him, surprised to find it was true. The memories no longer had the power to wound her. "Just remembering how we got here." Michael's eyes, that remarkable shade of gray-blue that still made her breath catch, studied her face. "We can leave if you want. This isn't worth your discomfort." Madison looked around the room. Faces she hadn't seen in decades stared back, not with pity now, but with something closer to admiration. A few old classmates smiled. One even mouthed, "Good for you." She squeezed Michael's hand. "Let's stay a little longer. I think I'd like to catch up properly." The weeks after Madison's divorce had been the darkest of her life. At 43, she'd found herself starting over with a fraction of the life she'd built. In a condo that echoed with emptiness after the sprawling Lake Forest home she'd decorated room by room. The settlement had seemed fair on paper, until she realized how completely her identity had been absorbed into Brian's. Her resume showed a 20-year gap. Her credit history was tied to Brian's accounts. Even her social circle had largely been composed of Brian's colleagues' wives, women who now avoided her calls as if divorce were contagious. "I don't know who I am anymore," she confessed to her sister Olivia during a tearful phone call. "I gave him everything, my career, my prime years, and he just replaced me, like I was an outdated appliance." "You're Madison Reed," Olivia had said firmly. "You always have been. He didn't take that away. He just made you forget for a while." Madison had clung to those words during the long nights when sleep wouldn't come, when the humiliation of being left for a younger woman threatened to drown her. Madison Reed, finance major, 3.8 GPA. A woman with ambition and intelligence that had nothing to do with being Brian Cooper's wife. The first step had been therapy with Dr. Levine, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who specialized in helping women rebuild after divorce. "Your story isn't unusual," Dr. Levine had told her during their first session. "Successful man marries bright young woman, slowly convinces her to shrink herself to fit his narrative, then discards her when she's served her purpose. The question is, what story do you want to write now?" Madison hadn't known the answer then. She'd only known she couldn't continue feeling this hollow, this erased. "Start small," Dr. Levine had advised. "One decision at a time that's purely for you. Not as a wife, not as someone's partner. Just for Madison." The first decision had been to enroll in a financial software certification course. The technology had changed dramatically since she'd left the field, but the fundamentals remained the same. Numbers still spoke to her, still made sense when nothing else did. The second decision had been to accept a part-time bookkeeping position at Archer and Associates, a small accounting firm in Evanston. The salary was a fraction of what Brian made in a month, but it was hers, earned with her mind, her skills. "You're overqualified," Jeffrey Archer had said during her interview, peering at her resume with obvious confusion. "Why would someone with your education want this position?" Madison had considered lying, crafting some palatable story about wanting work-life balance. Instead, she'd chosen honesty. "Because I need to start somewhere," she'd said. "I gave up my career for my husband's, and now I'm divorced at 43 with a 20-year gap in my resume. This job may be beneath my education, but it's a step toward rebuilding." Jeffrey had studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "My mother went through something similar in the 70s. Took her 10 years to get back on her feet. I'd like to help make your path a little shorter." He'd hired her on the spot, with the promise of increasing responsibilities as she proved herself. And she had proven herself quickly. Numbers had always been her language, and she spoke it fluently, even after years away. 6 months into her new job, Madison sat at her small desk, reviewing a particularly complex tax return for one of the firm's corporate clients. She'd spotted a potential issue with their depreciation calculations, nothing illegal, but an inefficiency that was costing them thousands. "Mr. Archer," she'd said, knocking on her boss's open door, "I think I found something in the Grant Industries file you might want to look at." Jeffrey had reviewed her notes, eyebrows rising. "This is good work, Madison. Really good. Would you be comfortable presenting this to the client yourself?" They're coming in tomorrow for their quarterly review. Me? The prospect had been both terrifying and exhilarating. I'm just the bookkeeper. You're a financial analyst who's been working as a bookkeeper, he'd corrected. And it's time you started stepping back into that role. If you want to. She had wanted to, desperately. The next day, dressed in her most professional outfit, a charcoal pencil skirt and blue blouse she'd bought on sale at Nordstrom Rack, Madison had sat in the conference room, waiting for the Grant Industries representatives. When the door opened, she'd expected junior financial officers. Instead, she'd found herself face to face with Michael Grant himself, CEO and majority owner. Mr. Grant, Jeffrey had said, clearly surprised. We weren't expecting you personally. End of quarter review seemed like a good time to get more hands-on with our accounting, Michael had replied, his voice deep and measured, especially with some of the expansion plans we're considering. Madison had felt a flutter of panic. She'd prepared to present to financial managers, not to the CEO of a company where her ex-husband worked as a regional VP. Did Michael Grant know who she was? Would this connection somehow get back to Brian? But there had been no flicker of recognition in Michael's eyes as he'd taken a seat across from her. Just polite attention as Jeffrey introduced her. This is Madison Reed, one of our financial analysts. She's identified some potential improvements in your depreciation schedules that could yield significant savings. Michael's gaze had been direct, assessing but not unkind. I'm interested to hear more, Ms. Reed. Taking a deep breath, Madison had launched into her presentation. As she spoke, explaining the complex calculations and potential tax advantages, something remarkable had happened. The nervousness had faded, replaced by the familiar confidence that came from knowing her subject thoroughly. This was her element, the world of numbers and analysis that had once been her career path. Michael had asked sharp, insightful questions that showed he was following her reasoning completely. Unlike many executives who delegated financial details to others, he clearly understood the nuances of what she was proposing. That's an elegant solution, he'd said when she finished. Simple but effective. How long have you been with Archer and Associates, Ms. Reed? 6 months, she'd answered honestly. His eyebrows had risen slightly. And before that? The question she dreaded. Madison had glanced at Jeffrey, who gave her an encouraging nod. I took some time away from the field, she'd said carefully. I was previously in corporate finance, but I've been out of the professional world for a while. She'd expected the usual dismissal that came when people realized her career gap, the subtle devaluation of her current insights based on her past choices. Instead, Michael had simply nodded. Well, your skills certainly haven't suffered. I'd like to implement these recommendations immediately. And I'd prefer that you personally oversee the transition, if Mr. Archer can spare you. Just like that, Madison had become the lead on the Grant Industries account. It was a small victory in the grand scheme of things, but it had felt monumental, the first real validation of her professional worth since before her marriage. Over the next 6 months, Madison had worked closely with Grant Industries' financial team, carefully avoiding any meetings where Brian might be present. The company was large enough, and Brian's division separate enough from corporate finance, that their paths never crossed. But the constant awareness of that possibility had kept her on edge. You should tell Mr. Grant about your connection, Jeffrey had advised after noticing her tension whenever Grant Industries meetings were scheduled. It's going to come out eventually, and it's better if it comes from you. Madison had known he was right, but the thought of that conversation filled her with dread. What if Michael Grant was friends with Brian? What if he decided the connection was too awkward and took the account elsewhere? The decision had been made for her on a rainy Tuesday in April, when she'd arrived at Grant Industries for a scheduled meeting to find Michael Grant alone in the conference room. The others are running late, he'd explained, gesturing for her to take a seat. Traffic accident on the Kennedy has everything backed up. I thought we might use this time to discuss the international tax implications of our European expansion. Madison had nodded, opening her portfolio when Michael had added casually, and perhaps you could explain why you never mentioned that you were previously married to my regional VP of Midwest sales. Her head had snapped up, heart pounding. You know, I've known since your second meeting here, he'd said, his expression unreadable. Brian Cooper's personnel file lists his ex-wife as Madison Reed Cooper. It wasn't difficult to make the connection. I should have disclosed that, Madison had admitted, her throat tight. I apologize for the oversight. It wasn't an oversight, though, was it? His tone hadn't been accusatory, merely observant. It was a deliberate choice to keep that information private. Madison had considered offering some professional explanation, but something in Michael's steady gaze had prompted honesty instead. Yes, she'd acknowledged. I didn't want to be defined by that relationship. I didn't want my work judged through the lens of being Brian Cooper's ex-wife. Michael had nodded slowly. I can understand that, particularly given the circumstances of your divorce. The implication that he knew about Tara, about Brian's infidelity, had made her cheeks burn. Mr. Grant, Please, he'd interrupted gently. I'm not judging you, Ms. Reed. Quite the opposite. I've been impressed by your work, your insights, and your professionalism. The fact that you've rebuilt your career after such a significant interruption speaks to your resilience and determination. Those are qualities I value highly. The unexpected validation had left Madison momentarily speechless. Thank you, she'd finally managed. I do have one request, however, Michael had continued. I'd like you to work directly with me on the European expansion project, rather than with the financial team. Your perspective would be valuable, and it would minimize any awkward encounters within the company. It had been a generous solution, one that both acknowledged the reality of her situation and offered a path forward that preserved her dignity. Madison had found herself studying Michael Grant with new eyes, noting the intelligence in his gaze, the quiet confidence that required no bluster, the consideration he showed in navigating this delicate situation. I'd be happy to, she'd agreed. Have you ever had to rebuild yourself after someone broke your trust? Share your story of resilience in the comments below. That meeting had marked the beginning of a new chapter. Working directly with Michael Grant had challenged Madison intellectually in ways she hadn't experienced in years. He'd pushed her to expand her thinking, to consider financial strategies beyond conventional approaches, to trust her instincts even when they ran counter to established practices. More surprisingly, he'd listened to her, really listened, in a way Brian never had, even in the early days of their relationship. When Madison spoke, Michael gave her his full attention, engaging with her ideas rather than merely waiting for his turn to speak. You have a unique perspective, he told her during a late working dinner at his office. Takeout containers from a nearby Thai restaurant spread across his conference table. You see patterns others miss. That's just how my brain works, Madison had replied, uncomfortable with the praise. I've always been good with numbers. It's more than that, Michael had insisted. It's intuition combined with analysis. You understand the human factors behind the financial decisions. That's rare and it's valuable. The compliment had warmed her in unexpected ways. Not because it came from a powerful man, she'd had enough of defining her worth through male validation, but because it recognized something essential about her, something that had nothing to do with her appearance or her role as someone's wife. Their professional relationship had developed over months of close collaboration. Madison had found herself looking forward to their meetings, to the intellectual challenge and the respectful exchange of ideas. Michael had never once made her feel less than his equal, despite the obvious disparities in their positions. It was during a business trip to New York, 6 months into their working relationship, that something had shifted. They'd been presenting the European expansion plan to potential investors. A grueling day of meetings that had stretched into evening. Madison had been on fire, fielding complex questions with confidence and clarity, her financial acumen on full display. After the final meeting, riding the elevator down from the 47th floor of a Manhattan skyscraper, Michael had turned to her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Have dinner with me tonight, he'd said. Not a question, not quite a command. Madison had hesitated, suddenly aware of the potential complications. We have an early flight tomorrow. I know. His gaze had been steady, direct. This isn't about work, Madison. I'd like to have dinner with you. Just you. The clarification had sent a jolt through her system, Part alarm, part something else she wasn't ready to name. Michael, if you're not interested, just say so, he'd said simply. No professional consequences, no awkwardness. We go back to Chicago tomorrow and continue exactly as we have been. The elevator had reached the lobby, doors sliding open to reveal the bustling atrium. Neither had moved. And if I am interested? Madison had asked, surprising herself with the question. A small smile had touched his lips. Then we have dinner at a restaurant I know in the village, where we talk about something other than tax implications and market expansion. We get to know each other as people, not colleagues. And we see where that leads. The directness had been refreshing after years of Brian's manipulations and half-truths. No games. No hidden agendas. Just an honest expression of interest and a clear path forward. I'd like that, Madison had said finally. Dinner had been at a small Italian restaurant in Greenwich Village, intimate without being overtly romantic. Over pasta and a bottle of excellent Barolo, they talked about everything except work. Their childhoods, his in Detroit, hers in Cincinnati. Their education, both first-generation college graduates. Their favorite books, he loved historical biographies. She preferred contemporary fiction. Why haven't you remarried? Madison had asked after their second glass of wine. Curiosity overcoming propriety. You're successful, intelligent, not terrible to look at. There must have been opportunities. Michael had laughed at her blunt assessment. Not terrible to look at? With compliments like that, I'm surprised you're still single. She'd smiled, acknowledging the deflection. You didn't answer the question. He'd considered for a moment, twirling pasta around his fork. I was married once, in my 20s. It ended after 3 years. Karen wanted the lifestyle of a CEO's wife without the reality of building a company. The late nights, the financial uncertainties, the sacrifices. When I had to choose between my dream and her expectations, I chose the dream. Do you regret it? Madison had asked. The divorce? No. The failure? Sometimes. He'd set down his fork, meeting her gaze directly. I regret that I couldn't be what she needed while still being true to myself. But I've learned that compromise only works when both people are moving toward each other, not when one person is erasing themselves to accommodate the other. The insight had struck Madison like a physical blow, articulating exactly what had happened in her marriage to Brian. She'd erased herself, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but his reflection. Your turn, Michael had said, refilling their wine glasses. Why haven't you remarried? You're brilliant, resilient, and definitely not terrible to look at. His smile had taken any sting from the teasing echo of her words. I'm still finding myself, Madison had admitted. After 20 years of being Brian Cooper's wife, I'm just beginning to remember who Madison Reed is. I can't risk losing her again. Michael had nodded, understanding in his eyes. That makes sense. For what it's worth, I think Madison Reed is extraordinary. And well worth the wait to get to know. The evening had ended with a simple kiss on the cheek outside her hotel room door. No pressure, no expectations, just the quiet acknowledgement of something beginning. Back in Chicago, their professional relationship had continued, but with an undercurrent of personal connection that grew stronger with each interaction. Michael had been patient, respectful of her need for independence, never pushing for more than she was ready to give. Their first real date had been to the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, 3 weeks after the New York trip. Their second, to an art exhibition at the Museum of Contemporary Art. Each encounter had revealed new layers of compatibility, of shared values and complementary differences. I'm not looking to rescue you, Michael had told her one evening as they walked along the lakefront. I know you're perfectly capable of building your own life. I just want the chance to be part of it. It had been exactly what Madison needed to hear. Recognition of her strength rather than her vulnerability. Respect for her journey rather than pity for her past. 6 months into their relationship, still carefully private to avoid workplace complications, Michael had made a proposal, not of marriage but of opportunity. I'm creating a new position, he'd explained over dinner at his penthouse apartment. The Chicago skyline glittering beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. chief financial strategist reporting directly to me. The role would focus on long-term financial planning, innovative funding structures, and strategic investments. Madison had set down her fork, studying his expression. And you're telling me this because? Because I want you to consider applying for it, he'd said simply. You're the most qualified person I know for this position. Your combination of analytical skills and creative thinking is exactly what Grant Industries needs at this stage of our growth. Michael, she'd said carefully, people would say you're only offering me this position because we're involved. People can say what they want, he'd replied, unfazed. I'm offering you this position because you're the best person for it. Our personal relationship is separate. Is it, though? Madison had challenged. Can you honestly say you'd make the same offer if we weren't dating? Michael had considered the question seriously, taking a sip of his wine before answering. Yes, I would. I might approach it differently, perhaps suggest you apply rather than directly offering it to you, but I recognized your talent long before I asked you to dinner in New York. The fact that I care about you doesn't diminish your professional qualifications. It just complicates the optics. Madison had felt torn. The position sounded perfect, challenging, influential, a true return to the career path she'd abandoned for Brian. But the specter of her ex-husband loomed large. Working directly for Grant Industries would mean potentially crossing paths with Brian, facing the whispers and speculation about how she'd secured such a prestigious role. I need to think about it, she'd said finally. Of course. Michael had reached across the table, covering her hand with his. Take all the time you need. The position won't be officially announced for another month. That night, lying awake in her own bed back in Evanston, Madison had wrestled with the decision. The professional opportunity was undeniable, a chance to fully reclaim her financial career at a level that would have taken years to achieve through conventional advancement. But the personal complications were equally undeniable. She'd called Olivia the next morning. He's offering you a C-suite position and you're hesitating? Her sister had asked incredulously. Maddie, do you know how many women would kill for that opportunity? It's not that simple, Madison had tried to explain. Brian works there. People will talk. They'll say I slept my way into the position. So what if they do? Olivia had challenged. Since when do you make career decisions based on what Brian Cooper or anyone else might think? The Madison I grew up with never let other people's opinions stop her. That Madison disappeared somewhere during 20 years of marriage. No, she didn't, Olivia had insisted. She just got buried under a lot of Brian's bullshit. But she's been digging herself out for 2 years now. Don't you dare shove her back down because you're afraid of what people might say. The conversation had stayed with Madison for days as she weighed her options. In the end, it wasn't Olivia's argument that convinced her, but a chance encounter at Whole Foods one Sunday afternoon. She'd been in the produce section, selecting apples, when a familiar voice had called her name. Turning, she'd found herself face to face with Tara Cooper, Brian's new wife. Madison, Tara had said, clearly uncomfortable but making an effort at civility. How are you? I'm well, thank you, Madison had replied, equally polite. At 28, Tara was pretty in the conventional way that had once made Madison feel invisible by comparison, blonde, slim, with the kind of youthful energy that Madison had lost somewhere in her 40s. Brian mentioned he saw you at work recently, Tara had continued, shifting her basket from one arm to the other. Something about you consulting for the company? The implication had been clear. Brian was keeping tabs on her, aware of her connection to Grant Industries. Whatever decision Madison made about the new position, Brian would have opinions, would likely share those opinions with others. Yes, I've been working with the financial team on some special projects, Madison had said, deliberately vague. Tara had nodded, clearly searching for something else to say. Well, it's good that you're, keeping busy, after everything. The condescension, however unintentional, had struck a nerve. Keeping busy. As if Madison's professional resurgence were a hobby, a distraction from the tragedy of losing Brian rather than the reclamation of her true self. In that moment, standing among organic produce with her ex-husband's young wife, Madison had made her decision. She would not allow Brian Cooper or anyone else to define her choices, her opportunities, or her worth ever again. The next day, she'd called Michael. "I want the position," she'd said without preamble when he answered. "But I have conditions." "I'm listening," he'd replied, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "First, I want to be evaluated on the same metrics as any other executive. No special treatment, no lowered expectations. Second, I want to disclose our relationship to HR and the board immediately, with a clear management structure that prevents any conflict of interest. And third," she'd taken a deep breath, "I want to keep our personal and professional lives completely separate at work. No special lunches, no private meetings that could be misconstrued, no preferential access." "Those all seem reasonable," Michael had agreed. "Anything else?" "Yes, I want to earn this, Michael. Really earn it. I don't want there to be any question in anyone's mind, including my own, that I deserve this position." "Madison," he'd said, his voice softening, "you've already earned it. But I understand what you're saying, and I respect it. We'll do this by the book, with full transparency and clear boundaries." True to his word, Michael had handled the transition impeccably. Madison's appointment as chief financial strategist had been announced with a company-wide email detailing her qualifications and the rigorous selection process. Their personal relationship had been disclosed to the board and HR, with appropriate management structures put in place to prevent conflicts of interest. The whispers had come, of course. Madison had felt the stares, had overheard the speculation about how she'd really secured such a prestigious position. But she'd held her head high, letting her work speak for itself. And it had. Within 6 months, Madison's financial strategies had helped Grant Industries secure favorable terms for their European expansion, resulting in a 12% increase in quarterly profits. Her innovative approach to corporate investment had caught the attention of industry analysts, who'd begun mentioning her by name in their reports on Grant Industries' growth. Brian had kept his distance, their paths crossing only at large company meetings where they could easily avoid direct interaction. Madison had occasionally felt his gaze on her during presentations, had noted the tightness around his mouth when her contributions were praised by other executives. But he'd said nothing, done nothing to openly challenge her position. Until the Christmas party, 11 months after she'd joined Grant Industries officially. The company had rented the grand ballroom at the Drake Hotel, sparing no expense for the annual celebration. Madison had arrived alone by design. She and Michael had agreed to maintain professional distance at company functions, at least until her position was firmly established on its own merits. She'd been at the bar, waiting for a glass of wine, when Brian had appeared beside her. "Quite the meteoric rise," he'd said, his tone just shy of sneering. "From bookkeeper to C-suite in what, a year and a half? I guess some skills never get rusty." The implication had been clear and deliberately cruel. Madison had turned to face him fully, taking in the slight flush that suggested he'd already had several drinks. "You know, Brian, I've often wondered what it must be like to be so deeply mediocre that you can only conceive of success in terms of who someone knows rather than what they can do." Her voice had been calm, measured, carrying no further than the two of them despite the noise of the party. "It must be exhausting, constantly looking for external validation because you know, deep down, that you haven't actually earned your place." Brian's face had darkened. "You think you're so much better than everyone else now, don't you? With your fancy title and your corner office. But we both know how you got there, and so does everyone else in this room." "No, Brian," Madison had replied, taking her wine from the bartender with a smile of thanks. "You think you know how I got here, because you can't imagine achievement without shortcuts. That says far more about you than it does about me." She turned to leave, but Brian had caught her arm, his grip tight enough to make her wince. "You won't last," he'd hissed. "Grant will get tired of you just like I did. And then where will you be?" Before Madison could respond, another hand had appeared on Brian's wrist, applying just enough pressure to make him release her. "I believe Ms. Reed was leaving," Michael had said, his voice pleasant but his eyes hard as he'd stepped between them. "And you and I need to have a conversation about appropriate workplace behavior, Brian. My office, Monday morning, 8 a.m. Brian had paled, suddenly remembering who he was speaking to. Mr. Grant, I was just... Monday, 8 a.m. Michael had repeated, his tone making it clear the discussion was over. As Brian had slunk away, Michael had turned to Madison, concern evident in his expression. Are you all right? I'm fine, she'd assured him, touched by his intervention but also slightly frustrated. I was handling it. I know you were, he'd said with a small smile. But I'm not just your boss or your partner. I'm also someone who can't stand by and watch you be disrespected, even if you're more than capable of defending yourself. The distinction had been important, recognition of her strength rather than assumption of her weakness. It had been one of the fundamental differences between Michael and Brian, between being controlled and being supported. Later that evening, after they'd maintained their professional distance throughout the party, Michael had driven Madison home to her condo in Evanston. Move in with me, he'd said as they'd sat in his car outside her building, snowflakes drifting lazily past the windows. Not because of what happened tonight, but because I love waking up next to you. Because my penthouse feels empty when you're not there. Because after a year together, I'm tired of pretending we're just colleagues during the day and lovers at night. Madison had felt a flutter of panic at the suggestion. Living together was a step she hadn't taken since Brian. A surrender of independence she wasn't sure she was ready for. I need my own space, she'd said carefully. I fought hard to create a life that's mine. I understand that, Michael had replied, reaching for her hand. And I'm not asking you to give up your identity or your independence. Keep the condo if you want, use it as an office, rent it out, maintain it as your personal retreat. All I'm suggesting is that we stop pretending our lives aren't already intertwined. He'd had a point. They spent 5 or 6 nights a week together already, alternating between his penthouse and her condo. Her clothes occupied half his closet. His favorite books lined her shelves. They were, for all practical purposes, living together already, just with the inefficiency of maintaining 2 separate residences. Let me think about it, she'd said, needing time to process the implications. Michael had nodded, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere. That night, alone in her condo, Madison had found herself standing in front of the bathroom mirror, studying her reflection. At 45, she wasn't the same woman who had married Brian Cooper at 22. Silver threaded through her chestnut hair, fine lines marked the corners of her eyes, and her body carried the subtle changes of middle age. But there was something else there too. A confidence, a self-possession that the younger Madison had lacked. Who are you now? She'd asked her reflection. And what do you really want? The answer had come with surprising clarity. She wanted Michael, not as a replacement for what she'd lost with Brian, but as a partner in what she was building now. She wanted the life they were creating together, a life based on mutual respect and genuine admiration rather than dependency or control. The next morning, she'd called him. Yes, she'd said when he answered, but I'm keeping the condo at least for now, and we maintain the professional boundaries at work. Agreed on all counts, Michael had replied, and she could hear the smile in his voice. When should I send the movers? They'd settled into a rhythm over the next 6 months, their personal and professional lives balanced with careful intention. At work, they were Mr. Grant and Ms. Reed, maintaining appropriate distance and formality. At home, they were Michael and Madison, building a relationship that honored both their individual strengths and their connection as a couple. The proposal had come on a Tuesday evening in June, over takeout Thai food on the penthouse balcony. No grand gesture, no public spectacle. Just Michael reaching across the table to take her hand, a small velvet box appearing beside her spring roll. I'm not asking you to be Mrs. Grant, he'd said, his eyes holding hers steadily. I'm asking if Madison Reed would consider becoming my wife, my partner, my equal in all things. Not to complete me or to serve as an accessory to my life, but to join me in building something neither of us could create alone. Madison had opened the box to find not a traditional diamond solitaire, but an elegant emerald-cut sapphire flanked by smaller diamonds. Unique, distinctive, nothing like the ring Brian had given her all those years ago. It reminded me of your eyes, Michael had explained, and of your spirit, deep, complex, valuable beyond measure. Tears had blurred her vision as she'd looked from the ring to the man offering it. Are you sure? I come with complications, with history. We both do, he'd replied simply. That's part of what makes us who we are today. I love you, Madison, not despite your past, but including it. Every experience, every scar, every triumph that shaped you into the woman sitting across from me now. She'd slipped the ring onto her finger, surprised by how right it felt. Yes, she'd said, her voice steady despite the tears. Yes, I'll marry you. They'd kept the engagement private for several weeks, telling only close family and friends. The question of how to handle the workplace announcement had been delicate, given Brian's position at the company. He'll find out eventually, Madison had pointed out during a Sunday morning discussion. Better that it comes from an official announcement than through gossip. Michael had agreed, and they'd decided on a simple approach. A joint email to the executive team, followed by a company-wide announcement the next day. Professional, straightforward, without fanfare. Brian's response had come within hours of the executive team notification. A terse email congratulating them both, so formally polite it bordered on sarcasm. Madison had deleted it without reply, refusing to give him space in what should be a joyful time. The wedding had been intimate, just 30 guests at Michael's lake house in Michigan, on a perfect September afternoon. Madison had worn a simple ivory-sheath dress, her silver-streaked hair loose around her shoulders. Michael had looked at her as she walked toward him on the beach with such naked adoration that several guests had been moved to tears. Not a second chance at love, Olivia had said in her toast, raising her glass to the newlyweds. But a first chance at the right kind of love. The kind that expands rather than diminishes, that celebrates rather than controls, that sees truly rather than selectively. They'd honeymooned in Tuscany, 2 weeks of sun-drenched days exploring ancient villages and wine-filled evenings under star-strewn skies. Upon their return, Madison had officially become Madison Reed Grant, keeping her maiden name as part of her identity while embracing her new partnership. The decision to keep their marriage quiet at work had been mutual, not out of shame or secrecy, but out of Madison's desire to continue establishing herself on her own merits, separate from her connection to the CEO. Only the executive team and HR had been informed of the change in their relationship status, which had made the high school reunion invitation that arrived 18 months later all the more interesting. Northbrook High, class of '93, Madison had read aloud, holding the embossed card. 25 years. God, that makes me feel ancient. Are you going to go? Michael had asked, looking up from his book. Madison had hesitated. I don't know. Brian will be there. It might be awkward. All the more reason to go, Michael had suggested. Show up looking fabulous, successful and happy. Living well is the best revenge. Isn't that what they say? She'd laughed, but the idea had taken root. Why shouldn't she attend? She had nothing to hide, nothing to be ashamed of. And yes, perhaps there was a small, petty part of her that liked the idea of Brian seeing exactly how well she'd landed on her feet. Will you come with me? She'd asked. Michael had smiled. Try to stop me. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to Timeless Love Tales with Mr. Harrison for more stories that heal the heart. And so here they were, at the Embassy Suites in downtown Chicago, with Brian Cooper's humiliation playing out in real time as he realized his ex-wife had married his boss. The perfect, poetic justice that Madison had never sought but couldn't help savoring just a little. Shall we get some air, love? Or would you like to stay and visit with your friends? Michael asked, his attention fully on Madison despite the spectacle unfolding around them. Madison looked around the room. Faces she hadn't seen in decades stared back, not with pity now, but with something closer to admiration. A few old classmates smiled. One even mouthed, "Good for you."